For most folks, they take war very seriously. However, what I have today is really a special guest because for most veterans, they take the war in many different ways, but this individual has taken war all the way back to the Iliad, and they carry their experiences for the rest of their lives. Josh Canning carried his way all back to Homer, and as they're serving in the United States Marine Corps as an Arabic cryptologic linguist, with two combat deployments to Iraq, he found himself asking questions that soldiers have wrestled with for nearly 3,000 years. These questions became a PhD and also then teaching epic literature and eventually a remarkable book, Fatal Second Helen, a modern veteran's Iliad. I'm Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and this episode is about the oldest war story in Western civilization and how it still speaks to modern audiences. It's about the human condition and how one Marine discovered that Homer's greatest epic wasn't simply history, it was also deeply personal. At one point, Josh explains why the Iliad really isn't about war. War explains modern veterans often recognize truths in Homer that civilians overlook. How ancient epic understanding courage, honor, grief, and moral injury, and why stories written nearly 3,000 years ago continue to shape the way we think about conflict today. With that, I want to welcome Josh to the program. Thank you so much for being here. Good to see you, Josh.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Outstanding. And I want to go back a little bit to some things that maybe we haven't seen for a long time, or maybe people don't realize. And what we have is really coming down to saying, let's go back to the very beginning. What first drew you in the Marine Corps toward military service?
Well, when I was in high school, I was a boxer and a wrestler, and I just enjoyed kind of combat sports, maybe broadly. I mean, the UFC wasn't really around. I mean, it was kind of around, but it was in its infancy in the late '90s, mid '90s. And so but I wasn't very good at either boxing or wrestling, so I couldn't necessarily go to college to wrestle because I knew I wasn't at that level. And so I thought to myself, well, I want some kind of environment that allows me to be physical and do sports and be combative, but that isn't as competitive, I suppose, as like a Division 1, 2, or 3 type of a program. And also, I knew that my family didn't have enough money to pay for college. So I was like, okay, I've got these two pieces of information. And with those pieces of information kind of floating in my head, I went on vacation with a friend, and that friend's older brother brought a friend. So the four of us were all hanging out, and that older brother, the friend of the older brother, was a Marine. He was on leave from the Marine Corps. He was very new to his, he's probably like 19 years old, very new to his experience in the Marine Corps. And he was telling us stories about training and stuff that he had been doing. And probably most of it was just boot camp and MOS school, but still, it was fascinating to me. And it just kind of settled on me like, okay, all these things that I want money for school. I want kind of adventure and to horse around and to do sports without maybe that competitive aspect. And that, well, the military sounds like it might be the place to allow me to do these things. And then, of course, if I'm going to do the military, I want to do the Marine Corps because I want to do the hardest and the best. I don't want to be in another service and look over the Marines and be like, oh, they're tougher than me and they look better in their uniforms than I do, et cetera. So it all ended up being quite simple. And I made that decision that summer, which was, I think, after my freshman year of high school. And the summer after my sophomore year of high school, I went to the recruiter for the first time. And they're like, well, you're way too young, but we're happy to talk to you and we'll fill you in on these details. And
Okay.
The summer after my junior year of high school, I actually signed my contract because you can sign a year in advance and enter what they call the delayed entry program. So I was as committed as I could be as a 16-year-old. Well, I signed the contract as a 17-year-old. You have to be at least 17, and your parents have to co-sign.
Right.
So we did that. And then the summer after senior year, 2 weeks after I graduated high school, I left for boot camp, Marine Corps boot camp. So, yeah, it's just a kind of a young kid looking for adventure and maybe a little bit of money for college.
Well, you got adventure. So you served as an Arabic cryptologic linguist with two combat deployments to Iraq. Looking back, what lessons from those years have stayed with you the longest?
Well, I think something the military is very good, for better or worse, is very good at doing is making you realize that there's some things that are worth getting worried about, and there's other things that just aren't worth it. And when I got back from Iraq, or when I left the military, I was part of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and I went back again in 2004 with the 24th MU Marine Expeditionary Unit. And so we came back together in, I think it was January, February of 2005, and then I got out in June of 2005. I had a 5-year contract, and nothing just seemed as scary or as important or as anxious as combat. So I went to college. I got what I wanted. I used my GI Bill, and I went to the University of Pittsburgh. And I remember one of my very first experiences was standing in line with my list of classes to register for classes. And there was a student in front of me who had just been told that it would take, I don't know, like a week or two to get something finished. This is over 20 years ago, so I'm a little fuzzy on the details, and she flipped out and stormed out of the registrar's office in anger because she had been told she had to wait a week or two. And I remember thinking, wow, it doesn't take much around here to get people agitated. And that was my first exposure to this idea, like, well, because I've seen some fairly intense things and been in some dangerous environments, everything else seems easy. and I'm really, really lucky. And I won't say this is true for all veterans. I think I was extremely lucky in that I was able to come out of my time in service with a relatively healthy mental health framework. And I know some of them personally, but I know a lot of other veterans have not had that luck that I had. And so maybe they're listening to me now saying, well, I see where he's coming from, but actually I get anxious about a lot of things. And I'm really sad that that's the case, because I recognize the military in some ways taught me what's worth being worried about and what's not worth being worried about. And so I was lucky to get the right message, or not, I shouldn't say the right message, but I was lucky to get a beneficial message or a beneficial mindset. And I'm really grateful for it. And now I work at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm the director of research in the Frederick Honors College. And it's a really stress-free job for me, because what can they do at the University of Pittsburgh that would ever come close to some of the things I had to stress out about in the military?
Sure. But you also took a different turn than most combat veterans and Marines. At what point did you start beginning asking questions that eventually led you towards studying the ancient world? In other words, why?
Well, I was really lucky. Again, my story is a story of luck. I'm just going to keep saying I was really lucky. When I went to the recruiter as a high schooler, they made me take a practice ASVAB. ASVAB stands for Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And this was it's the 20-minute test, and it was used to predict your actual ASVAB score, which is a percentile. And I got 99th percentile. And I had wanted to be an aircraft mechanic, because I thought, I don't know anything about mechanics. It'd be really cool to learn. And then for the rest of my life, I could fix my own car. Like, that was the way I was thinking. And the recruiter took a look at that 99th percentile practice ASVAB, and he said, nope, I'm not going to let you be a mechanic. And I said, oh, well, okay, what's the smartest thing you have? Because I didn't think of myself as a particularly smart individual, but I guess I was good at ASVAB tests. And he said, well, the smartest thing we have is the linguistics program, the cryptologic linguistics program. And you'll study a language and you'll be in the intelligence world. And I thought, well, that sounds cool. So I said, okay. And that was that easy. That's how that 10-minute conversation switched me from being an aircraft mechanic to a linguist. And I bring that up in answer to your question because then I went to the military and I studied Arabic for a year and a half. And it was really intensive. It was, 8 hours a day. Native Arabic speakers were teaching us. And it was an incredibly rich intellectual environment because we were all just basically learning Arabic as fast as we could. And, I'd always been a good, but maybe not exceptional high school student, but high school was easy for me. I just paid attention in class and I could take the test. And Arabic school was not that way. Like, you really had to work and really had to spend time thinking about memorizing your vocabulary and understanding grammar, etc. And I really enjoyed that intellectual stimulation, the intellectual challenge. And it carried me into an interest in linguistics more broadly. And so when I deployed, I brought linguistics books with me because I was like, oh, I know English and now I know Arabic. And there's a lot that they are, a lot of ways in which they are different. There's several ways that they're the same. Isn't this interesting? Let's think about how languages work. And so I started reading books about linguistics and just became fascinated by that field. And then, so again, my time in the military was quite intellectual, right? I went to a language school, and then when I was in Iraq, I was predominantly a translator, so I would translate wireless communications, but I would also be an interpreter when I would go with my commanding officer or whoever needed me, and I would speak Arabic, the Iraqi dialect of Arabic, to whoever they were trying to speak with. And so I remember one day I was working with this captain. I was enlisted, so I would have been a sergeant at the time. I was working with this captain who was paying this local police force. We were supporting the local police force. Excuse me. And in order to get your paycheck in this city's police force, you had to show that you still had your Glock pistol that the military had issued to all these Iraqi police officers. And because we were afraid they would sell them. So they would walk up, they would show their pistol, and they would have the serial number, and then the captain would check it off. And so my job is to translate all the reasons they didn't have their weapon. and we just spent a whole day doing this. And I remember I had such a headache. So I was interpreting Arabic for I don't know how long it was, 8 hours or something like that. Because there's all these excuses and all these reasons, and everyone had this is why I don't have my, or whatever. And I had such a headache afterwards. But then I remember I went to sleep that night and just had all these dreams in Arabic. And I was like, man, all I do is like think really hard about Arabic. And so when I got out of the Marine Corps in 2005 and wanted to go to college, my first choice for major was linguistics, because I just thought language was so interesting, and I had enjoyed Arabic and using Arabic so much. And then eventually I added anthropology with a focus on archaeology to that.
So there might be more of a transition that might have suspected, but most veterans don't pursue a PhD in classics. But even specifically, what drew you to Homer and ancient warfare?
Well, I was always a sucker for Greek mythology since I was in elementary school. And I remember when I got to middle school, so I read all of the Edith Hamilton and Thomas Bulfinch and Robert Graves was my favorite. So all of these later authors that wrote down the Greek myths, or Deleuze's Greek myths, I was a big fan of that when I was a little bit younger. So I'd read all these compilations of Greek mythology, all these retellings of Greek mythology. But I knew that the Iliad was out there. And obviously, there's a lot of original texts, but the Iliad had this place in my mind of like, well, that's it. That's the first one. It's the oldest one. It's one of the hardest ones. And so I had read all these other people writing about mythology. I was like, but I want to read the original stuff. I want to read the original source that all these other people are starting from or writing about. And so I think I was in 7th or 8th grade. I sat down with the Penguin edition of the Iliad, and it took me forever to read, but I loved it. And it changed my perspective on Greek mythology to being, oh, I just think these stories are really interesting, to being like, the Iliad is it. Like, yes, Greek mythology is still interesting, but the Iliad is the most interesting. And when I went to Iraq the first time, I had a copy of Stanley Lombardo's translation of the Iliad with me. And I ended up lending it to a lieutenant who never gave it back. So if he's listening, I hope he's grateful that he has my Lombardo translation of the Iliad. But so, yeah, the Iliad had a special place in my heart. Now, when I was in high school and in middle school, it was always a hobby. I never thought to myself, oh, I could make money with this, or I could do something with this. I never thought to myself, oh, I would actually study this for real. And even when I got to college, like I said, I started with linguistics. It wasn't until later in college that I added kind of the historical piece with archaeology. And then I was like, oh, well, now I'm doing linguistics and archaeology. And then, I went to get my PhD at the University of Chicago. And I worked on the Hittites, a civilization that was contemporary with the Trojans, neighbors of the Trojans, of the Trojan War, of the Iliad. And so I never actually got to dig at Troy. I never got to visit the site of Troy, which I still kind of regret. But I got to be really, really close. And so all of those experiences, the academic experiences, the military experiences, all kind of were, in some ways, were floating around the Iliad. And so I had all these ideas about what the Iliad got right about war, what it got wrong about war. And I thought about it archaeologically. I thought about the Iliad linguistically. Like, everything just kind of had the ability to focus on the Iliad in this fascinating way. And so finally, I just sat down to write about it. And that's what the book is now.
Well, curiously, I think that's a really good question to think about. How did your military experience change the way you read Homer compared to someone who just approaches it as literature?
Well, so as I said before, Iliad is mythology. Gods are running around. Achilles' spear is probably the size of a telephone pole, right? Like these impossible superhero type feats. I mean, the Iliad is the ancient Marvel universe, right? And so there's one way to look at that story as purely legendary, purely fantastical, purely made up.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I would read the Iliad and I'd say, yeah, that's all true. No human being can throw a telephone pole at another human being. No one's that strong. But there's also some pieces of this that seem awfully real. Hector, as a character in the Iliad, he's the eldest prince of Troy and the leader of the Trojans, felt really realistic to me. Achilles' grief when Patroclus dies at the hands of Hector felt really real. Some of the violence in the Iliad is very specific. I mean, people are getting stabbed through the throat and you can see the spear point coming out of their mouth, right? Like really graphic depictions of violence. And I thought,
Right.
well, that's interesting because if this is pure legendary, who would be worried about the details of where the spear came out of this person's body? And it just led me to think about, well, did the Iliad get some things right? Like, is it actually trying to depict warfare in a way that could be a little bit true? And then I read Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam. And Jonathan Shea is not a psychiatrist, is not a veteran. He is a psychiatrist, but he interviewed numerous Vietnam veterans.
Right.
He wrote this book, Achilles in Vietnam, that discusses how Achilles' behavior in the Iliad looks a lot like what we would call PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Jonathan Shea does not care for that term. He prefers moral injury, which you had mentioned earlier.
Right.
But regardless, battle shock, right? Whatever you want to call it. And I remember going into that book thinking I was already a veteran and I was already in grad school. And I remember thinking, I don't know. I was very skeptical that he could actually pull that connection off, that Achilles does have PTSD or what have you. But within 2 chapters, I was completely convinced. He turned me 180 degrees around. And I was like, this is a brilliant piece of work. And so his ability to find in the Iliad real depictions of what warfare can do to somebody, in this case Achilles, really anchored in my mind that maybe this book has more to say to us than just look at these fantastic gods and superhumans doing battle.
I see.
And so again, I was able to write my book with that in mind, pointing out, I mean, the main thesis of my book tries to do a lot of things, but my main thesis of the book is that warfare is terrible, and Homer or whoever wrote the Iliad knew that. It was actually using this book to remind us how terrible it is.
We'll flip the script a bit here, and so we know how you read. What misconceptions do students often bring with them when they first encounter the Iliad?
Well, I think that, for one, they think it's very difficult to read, and I wouldn't say that it's easy to read. But I think a lot of people are kind of intimidated by it. And one of the reasons they're intimidated by it is it's a little bit long, and it has long sections that are like very not complicated, but very detailed metaphors, right? Or similes. And you're like, okay, I get that this guy is rampaging like a lion coming down a mountain, tearing into a flock of sheep or something like that. But can I just get back to the story? And so I tell students, like, yes, I love the Iliad. I've loved it for how long now? Almost, 35, 40 years. And even I can say, yes, there are some boring parts of the Iliad. And when I read it, I read every word, but I do kind of glaze over a little bit because I'm like, okay. I get that this is a very descriptive scene, or very commonly the catalog of the ships in book 2 of the Iliad it's just a listing of who was at Troy. And then these people had this many group and were led by these guys. And it goes on for hundreds of lines. You're just reading about who's there. And so I tell people, like, it is not going to always be the most exciting part, but those parts that are exciting, and there are many, when you get to them, it's all worth it. When Achilles comes back to battle and goes on a tear, it is really gripping. It's so worth it to have gotten through the catalog of the ships, which is early in the book. And of course, Achilles' return is late in the book. So I think that the approachability of the book is often viewed incorrectly. It is quite approachable, especially Emily Wilson's new translation is so readable, but sometimes you have to be a little bit patient with it.
Mm.
And so, but again, it pays you back in the end. And
Well,
I think I wouldn't say that this is a misconception, but I think that it is an incomplete perspective on the Iliad. The Iliad is, I just said it's about the horrors of war, but it is also about the glory of war. It's kind of juggling these two ideas at the same time
mm,
because the entire Iliad is about the glory, really, is about the glory of Achilles, the best warrior, the greatest of the Greek warriors, the guy throwing telephone pole spears. And everybody wants to be Achilles. Everybody is in awe of Achilles. He is like the man. He's like the ultimate, the man's man. He's everything. And the Iliad is really building that for a lot. It spends a lot of time building that. It will give you a character like Diomedes who will go beat the god of war in battle and go beat all these other really great Trojan heroes in battle. And then he will say, but Achilles is better than me, right? Like everyone, it's even though a lot of the Iliad doesn't focus on Achilles, it's still focusing on Achilles and how great he is.
mm,
So there is absolutely this glorification of war and this glorification of one's own self-worth, one's own self-image that can come through war and being good at war. And that's absolutely Achilles. But Achilles is miserable. At the end of the Iliad, he is just completely broken and miserable. And so while I tell people, yes, of course, the glorification of war is part of the Iliad, the bigger part or the more fundamental part is the horror of war. So don't look at Achilles being the greatest of the greatest. Look at him as the guy rolling around on the ground, rubbing dirt into his face because he's so miserable because Patroclus, his best friend, has been killed.
mm,
And in the way the Iliad is structured, the final third of the Iliad, so Patroclus dies about 2/3 of the way into the Iliad, and so the final third is the reaction to Patroclus's death from the Greeks, from the Trojans, from Achilles himself, and everyone's just miserable because then Achilles goes and he kills Hector, and the Trojans loved Hector, and so Achilles and the Greeks are miserable that Patroclus died, especially Achilles, and then he kills Hector, and so all the Trojans are miserable, and so the Iliad ends with everyone being miserable. That's the last feeling you get out of this book. And so I think that's why my thesis is very much as it is that war is terrible. But someone like Alexander the Great famously read the Iliad and wanted to be the next Achilles. He was like, I am my generation's Achilles. And I am fascinated by that attitude. Now we don't have anything written by Alexander himself, right? We have later authors who wrote his history. So maybe he is misrepresented. I honestly don't know. But if the histories about him are true, and I think we don't have much reason to feel otherwise, he invades the Persian Empire, has several large battles and many small battles. In my opinion, missing the point that warfare is terrible. Now, it wasn't so terrible for him because it all ended well. I mean, he ended up dying in his 30s, so but he didn't die in warfare. He died in Babylon, and because he was sick, or some confusion as to what actually killed Alexander the Great. But he died at the top of his life, like
mm.
emperor, the largest empire ever, and could do anything he wanted to do almost. And so I think that probably adds to this perspective that, the Iliad is about the glory of war, because look at Alexander the Great and the Romans. So Alexander was looking to Achilles. Well, the Romans were looking to Alexander, right? Julius Caesar, again, the histories could be a little bit exaggerated here, but Julius Caesar wanted to be the next Alexander, and essentially was quite successful, I would say.
Mm.
And so all of these stories, all these histories that are looking back to mythology, the Alexanders and Achilles, or the Alexanders and the Julius Caesars, and there's many others, are focusing on the glory of war. And I just find that fascinating because to me, it's much more the horror.
Mm. What lessons about leadership emerge from the Iliad that remain relevant for military and civilian leaders alike?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't been asked that question before. I would say that the biggest lesson that comes out of the Iliad regarding leadership is it's not about you, right? Leaders who think it's all about them, Agamemnon, Achilles, are going to get in their own way. And that's exactly what happens in the Iliad. So Agamemnon, the Iliad opens up, and Agamemnon has this enslaved person, enslaved woman that gets taken away from him, and he's angry about that. And Achilles says, "You shouldn't be angry. We'll get you another one. Don't worry about it." He goes, "Well, you know what? I'm going to take your enslaved person. I'm going to take your girl." And he does, and that makes Achilles really, really angry. And Achilles leaves. He stops fighting because he's so angry, and because of that, the Trojans come out of the city. The Trojan had they been walled, stuck in the city of Troy at this point. So, because Achilles leaves the battle, the Trojans come out and they fight the Greeks, and tons of people die on both sides. And Agamemnon knew this would happen. He knew that if he treated Achilles in this way, a lot of Greeks would die, and Achilles knew it too. Achilles isn't the best guy. He let a lot of people on his own team die just because he was feeling angry. And it's Agamemnon making it all about himself, his pride, his ego, his sense of who he is in this community, clouded his ability to make the right choices. Achilles does the same thing. Achilles is also angry. He's also making it about himself, and he refuses to fight. As a consequence, lots of Greeks die. His best friend dies. Patroclus ends up dying. And so if you could, pull these two mythological figures aside and say, are you glad you made these leadership choices where you just made it about yourself and focused on what made you feel good or what served your image? I would hope that they would say, no, that was a huge mistake. It was the worst mistake of my life. And so I think the Iliad is very good at telling you it's not about you. If you're in the military, if you're in the corporate world, if you're in the nonprofit world, if you're leading people, it's not about you, it's about your people and about your mission. And if you can focus on quality in those compartments and let yourself be in the background, you're probably going to do a better job.
So do today's leaders underestimate the importance of narrative, and what can business leaders learn from epic literature?
I do think, underestimate literature. I don't know how, so it's fascinating that you asked me this question because, as I said, I've not been asked that question before about leadership in the Iliad. I do think that there are lessons there. There are cautionary tales. Basically, the Iliad teaches you how not to do it, right? And so I don't know that I would necessarily say all CEOs or all executive directors or all folks of that nature need to go read the Iliad so they can be better leaders. But I think that if they wanted to read the Iliad and see an example, granted, it's not a historical example, it's a mythological example, but it's still very human. The Iliad is full of people, human beings acting like human beings. Some of them are acting like superhumans, but emotionally, people are acting like people behave. If that wasn't the case, it wouldn't really work as a story because we are humans hearing it, expecting to hear about other humans. And so if they act like in a way that's entirely different the way humans behave, then it's not going to land. We're not going to be engaged. And so the Iliad is very emotional, very human. And so it does serve as a very powerful story of how selfish actions can negatively affect your outcome. How focusing on yourself or on your image. So I keep talking about focusing on yourself, but really I can drill down a layer deeper and say Agamemnon and Achilles in particular, but even Hector to some degree, they're all worried about their reputation. They're all worried about their glory. They're all worried about how they're being perceived. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think about that as fundamentally an insecure position. Right? They have this insecurity about how their society views them. And so they have to act in certain ways, violent ways, that solidify their reputation, solidify their image, their status. And it's not true. Like their image and their status is not being threatened. They're not actually being thought of as less than or less valuable, but they fear that they are being thought of in that way. And so they overreact to protect their image, to protect their ego, and it's very disastrous. And so, if leaders today are going to take something, and I think there could be multiple things, but I would say look for that focus on protecting your own self-image at the expense of others, and recognize that it's just not necessary. In most cases, I'm sure there are instances where it is necessary, but in general, your people's perception of you is not nearly as diminished as you think it is, or it's not nearly as big of a problem as you think it is. And so if you're going to overreact to it, if you're going to feel embarrassed and overreact, you're just going to make everything worse. I
Mhm.
think the Iliad is absolutely trying to tell you that.
What do you hope that students take away from studying ancient epic? What are the lessons?
Well, one of the things that I love the most is, as I said several minutes ago, just how human it is. So the Iliad is this 2,700 year old poem um, about these ancient Greeks, and you can still read it and say, oh my gosh, I completely understand where they're coming from. Even though we're millennia apart, even though we're geographically, culturally incredibly distinctive, I absolutely can tell where you're coming from. And so I like the idea that students can read this and they can say, not necessarily they're just like me, but to some degree, they can relate to these characters and relate to what they're feeling and what they're thinking and how they're behaving positively and negatively, and say to themselves, wow, we're all Homo sapiens, all the way back to wherever we differentiated from other hominids, right? And so I think people maybe perceive the Iliad as like stuffy and boring. And as I said before, there's moments where it's a little bit boring,
Yep.
but it's actually very, very emotional and very, very human. And so when you can see that emotion and you can see that human aspect, and you can say, I have felt that way, or I have behaved that way, or I've had that insecurity, then you're connecting with humans from 2,600 years ago. And they're not real humans, as I said, they're mythological humans, but you are connecting at least with maybe Homer or the poets that brought the Iliad to us.
If you could summarize what you think people should be taking away from the Iliad, what are kind of the biggest lessons? Like, what are the real takeaways you think could summarize the Iliad, which is a difficult book to summarize, but what do you think people should take away from it?
I think they should take away the fact that war is terrible. I think they should take away the idea that if you see your value to society as someone who can do violence, as someone who excels at violence, there are some problems with that. If you're a defender, so Hector is a defender. In fact, his name in Greek actually goes back to the solid one, the one who stands firm, right? Hector is defending his homeland. And so his ability to do violence in protection of his homeland, I think, is more admirable than Achilles' ability to do violence to take somebody else's homeland away. And so, if you're going to identify someone who is good at violence, whose value to society is a violent value, then at least let it be someone who is protecting people instead of someone who is attacking people. And I think that because I think Hector in the Iliad, the one who is defending, is the most human of all the characters of the Iliad. And I think we are absolutely meant to view him as a person we can connect with. He's not necessarily the hero of the Iliad. Clearly, Achilles is the hero, but in some ways, he is the hero of the Iliad. He's the hero that loses, but he is the one doing the right thing. And Achilles, over and over again, is doing, in my opinion, the wrong thing. And so hopefully people can recognize that we do sometimes need to defend ourselves. Absolutely. And sometimes violence is a part of that defense. I'm not trying to say violence is always bad. I just said I was a boxer and a wrestler, right, in the beginning of this podcast. Um, but there are ways in which violence is truly valuable to society, and there's ways in which it's actually quite destructive. And the Iliad shows us both.
Josh, I want to thank you for your time today. You've really shared some really insightful things. I'm wondering now if you could share, is it possible for people to reach out to you? Where could they get the book and how do they find out more about yourself, your background, and the Iliad too?
So yeah, my book has a website, veteransiliad.com. And so you can purchase the book there on Amazon or on Square or via Amazon or Square. And also my website has a little bit of a biography about me and has a little web page where you can get in touch with me. And I would be delighted to talk with folks about any questions they might have or any thoughts they might have. Please feel free to reach out to me via the website.
That's awesome. It's really valuable. It's 3,000 years old, but in some ways, if you read it, it's fresh and it applies to today's newspapers, which is the exciting thing about epic literature. Josh, thank you very much for really telling us about your very unique background and unique insights that you've been able to glean from this epic that everybody should be reading. Thank you very, very much.
Well, Mick, thank you. And thank you very much for having me.
You bet. Thanks again. If you enjoy these programs, and hopefully that you do, hope that what you'll do also is then go to the Doctor of Digital podcast and subscribe, like, and also share widely as well. Hope you enjoyed the program. Until the next episode, this is the Doctor of Digital signing out. Deus Volt.